Hey everyone, welcome to Cool Chess. Has it ever happened to you when you were playing chess that you made the first few moves, thought you had a good position, but just couldn't figure out how to continue? If the answer is yes, then you should definitely watch this video, because now you'll learn how to make a good plan with a game you'll never forget. First, I'm going to show you a famous game where you can see what it's like when someone can't find a plan, and what it's like when someone plays chess following a good plan. Then I'll give you 10 tips that will help you when you're creating a plan. Alright, let's get started then. The white pieces are in the hands of Friedrich Semisch. He's famous for coming up with a great opening variation that's a common choice when facing the King's Indian and Benoni. And playing the black pieces is none other than the famous chess theory expert Aaron Nimzowitsch. Now, this game isn't from today, it's actually from way back in 1923, so over 100 years ago. But as you'll see, they were already playing at a pretty high level even then. Since this is quite an old game, the opening wasn't played in a very precise way. The opening is the Queen's Indian defense, the so-called traditional line. Over the years, chess players have figured out that it's worth messing with white's calm development a little bit by playing bishop to a6 and bishop b4 check instead of bishop b7. But hey, 100 years is 100 years, you know? So after a few standard developing moves, black decided to shut down the long diagonal with the move d5. Well, this move isn't exactly the most accurate either. The d5 pawn blocks the bishop on b7, and the problem for black is that unlike the bishop on g2, the one on b7 isn't protected. However, back in those days, they still put a bigger focus on controlling the center with pawns. So, white puts his knight in the center, and black stabilizes his pawn center with c6. Well, that bishop on b7 doesn't look good, does it? At this point, white took the pawn on d5, which actually made things a bit easier for black. If white had played e4 instead, black would have had a much harder time. Even so, white can't really complain. His bishop gets a nice outpost on f4, and after black plays a6 to prevent knight b5, white is able to occupy the open c-file with his rook. Black gains some space on the queen side with b5. He would actually have a nice position if that bishop on b7 wasn't so terrible. Here white played queen b3 and was probably thinking, I've developed my pieces really nicely, connected my rooks, everything's just great. Honestly though, that's a bit of an oversimplified way to think about piece development. Let's rewind one move. White could have found a better move if he'd just asked, do I have any piece that's not well placed? Because developing your pieces isn't just about getting them away from their starting positions, the key is to get them to the right places. Let's quickly run through our pieces. Our rook is on the open file, which is awesome. Our two bishops are okay. The knight on e5 is fantastic, but the other knight has nothing to do on c3. The black pawns control all the important squares where that knight could go. Plus, it's even blocking the rook's path on the c-file. Alright, so the knight's in the wrong place, but where would be a good place for it? You know what? I'm gonna make you think about this a little. When I was learning chess as a kid, I always liked it when the teacher asked questions, especially because you often got chocolate for the right answer. If you've watched our videos, you'll be familiar with the 5-second challenges, so let's figure out which square we should target for our knight on c3. Okay, time starts now. And the target square is none other than the c5 square. The c5 square is a weak point for black because neither his b-pawn nor his d-pawn can control it. So, they can't push the white knight away from that spot. Okay, but how on earth do I get my knight there? Do you remember me saying that the point of developing our pieces isn't just to move them from their starting square, but to find the right spot? Well, now we actually need to go back to the starting square to get to the right spot. The best move is knight to b1. Besides opening up the file for our rook, we've also prepared a knight maneuver to d2, then b3, and finally to c5. Alright, so hopefully you now understand the difference between a developed piece and a powerful piece. Let's get back to the game now, where, as we said, white played queen b3 instead of knight b1. Of course, black also wants to keep up in development, so he moves his knight to c6, which puts pressure on both the d4 pawn and the e5 knight. Wouldn't it be so much better if our knight wasn't on c3, right? Because then our rook would also have control over the c6 square. White couldn't think of a better move, so he exchanged his knight, and he had to say goodbye to one of his active pieces. Okay, and now comes the interesting part, making the plan. I hope a lot of you have watched our videos on chess strategy. If you have, you might have seen this diagram in those already. Okay, let's see. According to the diagram, once the opening phase is pretty much over, you need to come up with a plan, which really helps in figuring out your moves in the middle game. So here we are, and White's got to figure out what to do next. To create a correct plan, we have to evaluate our own position and our opponent's position. We've already covered position evaluation in one of our earlier videos, so now let's analyze this position based on what we learned there. So, the first thing we're going to look at is the value of the pieces. If we really wanted to, we could go through and count the value of all the pieces and see that both white and black have 35 points. But really, there's no point in doing that because there's just been 2 exchanges, so the values are equal. The next thing we need to check is the safety of the kings. We can go through this quickly as well, because both kings are absolutely fine. However, the next point, which is none other than the pawn structure, is going to be more interesting. The pawn structures are symmetrical, and there are no isolated or doubled pawns. But later we must say a few words about black's queenside pawns. But before we talk about them in detail, let's see what the last thing is we need to check when evaluating a position. It's the activity of the pieces. So, let's check out how active white's pieces are. We've already talked about the knight on c3, which isn't on the ideal square. The power of the bishop on g2 is limited by the black pawn on d5, but our bishop on f4 has excellent control over the queenside. Our rook on c1 has already taken control of the only open file, which is great, and our queen has also come into play. Okay, and now let's see the black pieces. When we look at black's pieces, there are 2 main things to point out. The bishop on c6 is very passive, and black is a little bit behind in developing his pieces. Okay, and now let's go back to black's queenside pawns for a moment. If you've played or watched a lot of chess games, you might have noticed that you often have to take on some positional weaknesses in exchange for activity. That's exactly what happened in this game too. Black's A and B pawns moved forward, giving black space on the queen side that he can fill up with his pieces if he has enough time. However, because black's pawns have moved forward, they've become vulnerable and a bit weak. And another positional weakness, as we've already mentioned, is that the c5 square has become weak for black. You have to give something to get something, right? Okay, so now we know quite a lot about the position, but there's still something you need to know so you can make a good plan. Let me share with you something important that you should always remember. Where we have more power than our opponent, that's where we can beat him. So, if you can make the fight happen where your pieces are strong, then you'll win. Let's see what this means in this position. White's bishops are mainly focused on the queen side, our rook has taken control of the open file on the queen side, and our knight and queen are also there. Also, we just noted that black's queenside pawns could be a bit vulnerable. Okay, now that we've gone through everything, let's see what white played. Pawn to h3? Huh? What is that? What's the idea behind that? Didn't we just say we should be doing something on the queen side because that's where our pieces are? Yeah, you're totally right. It's just that Samish didn't see this video 100 years ago. And by the way, he also didn't play thousands of online chess games a year to learn from. Back in the old days of chess, there were 1 or 2 brilliant minds, but for the players who were considered the second level, it was pretty typical for them to play super well sometimes, but other times they wouldn't always figure out which piece to pick up. So it looks like this wasn't Samish's great day. Instead of that absolutely useless h3 move, white could have gained the initiative by playing knight to e4. This little tactic is based on the fact that the black bishop is hanging on c6. Although black temporarily gains a pawn advantage, the activity of white's pieces provides compensation for it. With accurate play, black can probably hold his position, but it's worth keeping in mind that when the position opens up, it usually benefits the player with the more active pieces. And now I'm going to cheat a little bit. I know exactly what's going to happen to white in the rest of the game, so from now on, I'm going to look at things from black's side. So, let's flip the board. Okay, so now that we've flipped the board, let's quickly come up with a plan for black too. It'll be quick, I promise. We're done with evaluating the position. We're pretty lucky as black. Besides the fact that our opponent clearly has no clue what plan to choose, his h3 pawn move has also weakened his king's position a little. So, where should we play then? On the king's side or the queen's side? White's forces are on the queen's side and his king's position is weakened. Of course, we're attacking on the king's side. But before we do that, we've got something to take care of. When you're attacking on opposite sides of the board, it's a bit like fencing. Sometimes you've got to block a couple of attacks before you can launch your own. So, no matter how much we want to attack our opponent, we first need to defend our bishop on c6, otherwise we could get into trouble. Black didn't forget about that and played queen to d7. White still couldn't come up with a plan, so he decided to move his king to h2, thinking it would be a slightly better place. Now, white isn't threatening anything, so we can start our attack. How do we begin? We've already gone through the steps of an attack in one of our previous videos. Let's see. What was the first condition for a successful attack? The majority of the attacking pieces. It's great if we can throw one of our pieces into the attack, but it's even better if we can also chase away a defending piece at the same time. Which move do you think achieves that? Knight to h5. Very useful move. The bishop on f4, which was doing such a great job controlling the black queen side, is now moving back to d2. And now let's continue our attack. The next step is to weaken the pawn shield. It is good for us that white has already started to weaken his own pawn shield with the h3 move, but it is still not enough. We need a little extra help. So, pawn to f5 is coming. It is a very important attacking move. Why? We want to play f4 with black, and with that move, we'll not only weaken the pawn on g3, but also get our rook from f8 into play. In this position, white thought he'd move his queen to the king side with queen d1, seeing as that's where all the action was going on. There was another aim behind this move as well. White has a little trap in mind for black, at least that's what white thinks. After the queen moved, white's dominance on the queen side has decreased, so we've got a chance to advance a little bit there as well. b4 is coming. Our queenside pawn is pushing the white knight back, and at the same time, it is creating space for our bishop on b5. It's interesting to see how much the position has changed in just a few moves. Not long ago, white was the more active player, but now he can hardly make a move. This is what happens when you play without a plan. White moves his rook from f1 to get his e-pawn out of the pin, and black brings his other bishop into the game. The d6 square is a great spot for the bishop because this increases the pressure on the g3 pawn even more. And in this position, white has made a huge mistake. By playing his pawn to e4, he carries out the threat he had in mind when he moved his queen to d1. The idea behind this move is that the black knight on h5 is hanging, and the e4 move creates a discovered attack on it. Remember when I said that opening the position is good for the player with more active pieces? If you remember that, then I really hope you wouldn't play e4. Poor white hadn't had the chance to see our videos yet, so he fell into his own trap. Black thought that a knight was no big deal and sacrificed it for the attack, so black played f takes e4. White took the knight and black captured the pawn on f2. With that move, white also started the third step of leading the attack, destroying the defense. Now the g3 pawn is only defended by the king, and we couldn't wish for a better place for our rook than the f2 square. White defends the g3 pawn with his queen, and black just brings his other rook into the action as well. Now rook to f3 is a really serious threat because the bishop on g2 is pinned and cannot take it. Check out how effectively our bishop is working from b5. The light-squared bishop, which was recently stuck behind its own pawns, is now excellently controlling the super-important f1 square. So, white played king h1, and black sent away the white queen from the g5 square. The queen moved to the only available spot, e3, and black then played bishop to d3, shutting in the white queen. You can see how white is slowly running out of options move by move. Every move black makes feels like a hammer blow, and white is just going with the flow. As if white didn't have enough problems with the g3 pawn, now another threat has appeared. Black is threatening to trap the white queen with rook to e2. Poor white. There's nothing else to do, rook to e1 has to be played. And now it's time for another 5-second challenge. The next move is what made this game famous. I wonder if you can figure it out. Black to move and the clock starts now. Okay, so here black played h6. Why is this such a strong move? Because white practically has no moves. Okay, black has other good moves too, but this one is definitely the coolest. Let's check out white's possible moves. So first of all, the queen has no safe squares to move to, so the white queen can't move. The king can't move because then rook f3 is coming. The rook on g1 can't move to f1 because it would be taken, and the rook on e1 can't leave its square because then rook to e2 would trap the queen. The bishop on d2 can only move to c1, but then the knight on b1 would be captured. The bishop on g2 can't move either, because black controls the f1 square. Finally, there's nowhere the knight on b1 can go without being taken. It's ironic that white is up a piece, but he can't make a move with any of them, isn't it? Okay, so what about the pawns? Can white do anything at all with them? Let's see. If the pawn goes to g4, then black plays rook f3, and the bishop can't take it because rook h2 is checkmate. And what if white tries to play a3? That doesn't help white, because black simply plays pawn to a5, and white is in trouble again. And what happens if white plays a simple b3? Nothing. Black simply makes a waiting move like king h7, and then we just wait for white to run out of pawn moves. White went through all these lines and having no better option resigned the game. This game is the so-called immortal Zugzwang game. The term Zugzwang originates from German, meaning compulsion to move. So you really don't want to move, but you just have to. It's really unusual for a player with so many pieces not to have a single useful move, and that's what makes this game so remarkable. Okay, so after the game, let's jump into my top 10 tips. Before we get to the tips, I'd like to encourage you to write a comment and tell us what topic you're most interested in. Chess has so many topics, and we try to cover the ones that most of you are interested in first. This video about planning was made because many of you asked for it. So, feel free to ask us, and we'll try to make it happen for you. Okay, let's get back to the tips. The first tip is really important because it can help you a lot when you're making a plan. It is about the opening. When you're learning a chess opening, don't focus on memorizing the moves. Always learn the ideas and plans. They're much more important than the concrete moves. And if you know the plans, it will be easier to remember the moves as well. The next tip is about the king's position. The safety of your king is super important when you're making a plan, so when you're planning, the first thing you should consider is where your king is going to be. Should I castle short or long? Or maybe I'll just stay in the middle? You need to make that decision and then set up your other pieces to go with it. The next important question is which side of the board should we play on? The king side or the queen side? Should we try to occupy the center, or is it okay if we just control it? It's essential to decide which side of the board you want to focus on so you can try to get the upper hand there. Think back to the game and how quickly white got into trouble because he didn't know what to play for. The next tip is simply the importance of position evaluation. You've got to learn how to evaluate the position, otherwise you won't be able to come up with the right plan. The next one is none other than flexibility. By correctly evaluating the position, you should be able to notice when you need to come up with a new plan. Did the pawn structure change or did you swap queens? It's quite possible you'll need to change your plan. The next tip, which is to take a break, is related to this point. When the position changes, clear your mind, look at the position with a new perspective, and then make a new plan. The next tip is that you should always keep your opponent's plans in mind. This helped black in the game we just looked at to understand that white didn't have a single useful move. The eighth tip is to give your opponent as few chances for counterplay as you can. This is where thinking like your opponent helps you. In the process of planning, as in everything else, time is very important. Sometimes you have more time to improve the position of your pieces, but other times every move is super important. If you remember, in the game we just looked at, there would have been time to move our knight to c5 because the position was closed. In an open position, there simply wouldn't have been time for that. Always be aware of what you have time to do and what you don't have time for in the current position. I've already discussed the last point in another video, but it's so important that we absolutely have to include it in this list as well. And this is what we call simple chess, which means you should always try to go for the simplest, most secure solution. Okay, so these are my top 10 tips for you. Thanks for watching the video. I really hope you liked it. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet, because you can expect plenty more videos like this. And we're also waiting for your topic suggestions. Okay, see you in our next video.